This lesson is about neuroscience or biological psychology. This perspective is focused on our physiology. A neuroscientist is concerned with connecting our biological functions to our behavior. How do the parts of the brain or chemicals in your body like neurotransmitters and hormones influence us? An early attempt to try and make this brain-body connection was in the 1800s by a man named Franz Gall. He came up with what's known as phrenology. He believed that certain patterns of bumps on our skull were connected to behavior traits or personality traits or mental abilities. So he mapped out different bumps and would connect them to those specific traits. Of course, that's outdated, but this was an early attempt to try and make that connection. The nervous system is responsible for getting information from the outside world up to your brain. The basic unit of the nervous system that carries this information from your senses to your brain is the nerve cell, or neuron. Neurons pick up sensory input from your eyes, ears, nose, mouth, or skin, and like a relay race, they transmit the information up to your brain for interpretation. We're going to look at the different parts of the neuron. The dendrites are the input structure of the neuron. These branches pick up information from your senses or other neurons and bring the impulse into the nerve cell. Once the impulse comes in through the dendrites, it is then sent to the cell body or soma, which contains the nucleus or brains of the cell. The nucleus will determine whether or not to send the impulse along. It has to meet a certain threshold or intensity. Students often ask, why wouldn't an impulse be sent? Let's say a fly lands on your shoulder and you didn't feel it, but someone comes up to you and says, hey, you have a fly on your shoulder. When it landed, sensory impulse is fired, but because it is so light, it didn't meet the intensity or threshold to get to your brain for interpretation. Therefore, you would never know it was there. When the nucleus decides to send the impulse, it then travels to the axon. This is the output structure. The axon will carry the impulse away from the cell body to a neighboring neuron. There are two different parts of the axon. First, the tube-like structure. This is the longest part of the neuron. It can vary from very tiny to up to 3 feet in length, depending on the location in the body. The second part is the axon terminal. This is where the impulse will stay until it is sent to the neighboring neuron for the process to begin all over again. Similar to an airport terminal, where people wait to transfer to a new vessel. The myelin sheath is a fatty casing. It is a protector or insulator of the axon. Not all axons are myelinated, but those that are will have faster transmission. This fatty casing increases the speed. As we age, the myelin sheath naturally breaks down. Therefore, as we get older, we cannot react as fast to stimuli. It takes longer for an impulse to get to our brains for interpretation and then react. This is why older people are more at risk for accidents. The action potential refers to an active neuron, meaning the impulse is being sent down the axon. Here we would say the action potential is occurring. If the action potential is occurring, the cell is depolarized. When it's depolarized, positively charged sodium ions rush through the axon like a domino effect. When it is resting or inactive, it is considered polarized. As I said before, in order for the nucleus to send the impulse down the axon, it has to reach a certain threshold or intensity. It either fires or it doesn't. This is called the all or none response, like a gun. The impulse will either fire down the axon or it won't. It can't just travel down the axon part way and then stop. Before we talk about how neurons communicate with one another and the impulse gets from the axon terminal of one nerve cell to the dendrite of a neighboring, let's review the different parts of the neuron once more. First of all, the dendrites, that will be the input structure. The dendrites will pick up the impulse from a neighboring neuron or from one of the senses. That impulse will then be sent to the cell body or soma. The cell body houses the nucleus. The nucleus will determine whether or not to send the impulse along. If the impulse meets a certain intensity or threshold, the nucleus will then send the impulse down the axon. The axon is the longest part of the nerve cell, and it is the long tube-like structure you see in the diagram. Some axons are covered in a fatty casing that protects it called myelin sheath. The myelin sheath will help increase the speed of the impulse. If the nerve cell is depolarized and the impulse is being sent down the axon, we say the action potential is occurring. The action potential or impulse will then travel into the tiny branches on the right, which is the axon terminal. Here the impulse will wait to be sent across the gap to the neighboring neuron. In this diagram on the right, you can see an axon terminal enlarged. Sometimes the axon terminal is called the synaptic terminal, or sometimes called the terminal buttons. All of those mean the same thing. Below the axon terminal, you can see a tiny little gap between the axon terminal and the neighboring dendrite of the next nerve cell. That gap is referred to as the synapse, or sometimes called synaptic gap, and it is very, very tiny. Inside of the axon terminal, you'll see sacs that have little chemical messengers inside of them. These are called synaptic vesicles. When the action potential or impulse comes into the axon terminal, those synaptic vesicles are zapped and they're pushed towards the synapse or gap between the neurons. When those synaptic vesicles get to the gap, the chemical messengers or neurotransmitters are released. The chemical messengers or neurotransmitters will be what crosses over the synapse and connects to a receptor site or binding site on a neighboring dendrite. Then a channel will open up and the impulse will be sent, and the process starts all over again in the next nerve cell. In this diagram, you see the synapse, and above that you see one of the synaptic vesicles. When the synaptic vesicle gets to the synapse or the membrane of the axon terminal, those chemical messengers, those neurotransmitters, will cross over the synapse. They will connect to a binding site or receptor site on the neighboring dendrite. When they connect, they fit like a lock and a key. And then the channel opens up and the impulse or positive ion will be sent through, and the process starts all over again. So let's review this whole process of neural communication. At the top, you see a diagram of the nerve cell, or neuron. So first of all, the impulse is brought in through the branches, the dendrites. Then the impulse will be sent to the cell body or the soma. Inside of the cell body, you find the nucleus. The nucleus will determine whether or not the impulse meets a certain intensity or threshold in order to be sent. If it does, the impulse will then be sent down the tube-like structure, the axon. If the impulse is being sent down the axon, that means the nerve cell is active or the action potential is occurring, and the nerve cell is depolarized. The fatty casing around some of the axons is called myelin sheath. It is a protector and helps speed up the impulse. Once the impulse travels down the axon, it will stop in the axon terminal. Here the impulse will wait to be sent across the synapse, or the gap between neurons, onto the next nerve cell, or the dendrite of the next nerve cell. So the diagram in the middle, you see an enlarged axon terminal. So the impulse is coming into the axon terminal. It will zap the large sacs called synaptic vesicles. They will be sent towards the synapse, or the membrane. If you look at the diagram at the bottom right, you see the synaptic vesicle at the synapse. Here, the neurotransmitters that are inside of the synaptic vesicles will cross over the synapse, or gap, and they will connect to a binding site, again fitting like a lock and a key. Certain neurotransmitters fit certain binding sites. When they connect, a channel will be opened up, and the impulse will be sent through, and the process begins all over again. Here I would like you to pause for a moment and see if you can put the different steps in order for neural communication. The first step would be the dendrites receive the impulse. The second step, the nucleus, will send the impulse. The third step, the action potential, is taking place. The fourth step, the synaptic vesicles are stimulated. Then the neurotransmitters cross the synapse. And finally, the neurotransmitters connect to a binding site. Sometimes there are excess neurotransmitters floating around in the synapse. As we will learn in the next lesson, neurotransmitters can affect our thoughts or our behavior. We want an adequate balance. We don't want too many or too few of them. So when we have excess in the synapse, the sending axon terminal will reabsorb them, take them back in. And this is the process known as reuptake.